I'm Mindy Crawford, Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania. We are the statewide advocacy voice for historic preservation, helping people protect and preserve the places that they love. We work to ensure that legislation, policies, and programs support the work of preserving our past. Our webinar tonight is presented in partnership with Preservation Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Modern Committee. They are a community-based advocacy organization that believes everyone deserves a voice in preserving the city of Pittsburgh. Tonight's free webinar is made possible by our members and donors. Neither organization is supported by government funding. We rely on passionate folks like you to support our work. Thank you to those of you who are already members or donors of the organization. If you are not, please consider supporting our work through membership or donation. We'll put links to both organizations in the chat box. This webinar is a little different because we're covering two different topics, but they are related. It's two examples of mid-century corporate campus design. One is for sale and was nearly demolished for warehouse development. The other has been re-envisioned, revitalized, and reopened as Bell Works, a thriving mixed-use community hub. The former Westinghouse Research and Development Center was placed on Preservation Pennsylvania's 2022 Pennsylvania at-risk list. At the time, it was threatened with a large-scale Amazon warehouse that would have cleared the site of its historic buildings. Our first two speakers will be talking about the history of the site and its potential for redevelopment that respects its mid-century modern architecture. Brittany Reilly is the founder of the Pittsburgh Modern Committee, advocating for the appreciation of our region's 20th century modern and postmodern architecture, public art, and design. Since 2018, she served on the board of directors of Preservation Pittsburgh and is committed to the region's historic architectural and cultural heritage. Brittany is the executive director of the Irving and Aranel de Groy Gruber Foundation and Collection, representing the creative legacy of artist Aranel de Roy Gruber, 1918 through 2011, through exhibitions and special projects, and oversees the foundation's support of the arts in Western Pennsylvania. Bill Callahan is the Western Pennsylvania Community Preservation Coordinator for the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. The PASHPO is part of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, and Bill is located at the Fort Pitt Museum in Pittsburgh. The SHPO is responsible for implementing state and federal historic preservation programs throughout the Commonwealth. Bill has nearly 30 years' experience working with federal, state, and local historic preservation programs in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Nebraska, and has also worked in the private sector for several years, managing two businesses in a historic downtown. Thank you, Bill and Brittany. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mindy. Good evening, everyone. I'm so appreciative for everyone's attendance and interest tonight. And I just want to start with a very quick thank you to Mindy, Sabra, and this wonderful effort of Preservation Pennsylvania, the State Historic Preservation Office, and my co-speaker, Bill Callahan, my colleagues at Preservation Pittsburgh and the Modern Committee, the Heinz History Center Library and Archives, who are stewards of the Westinghouse collection, the Churchill community and Churchill Borough, a network of former Westinghouse employees, with a special thanks to an Andy Harvilla, who shared with me a very useful collection of photographs, many of which you'll see tonight, and Docomomo US, the National Organization for the Preservation of Modern Architecture. They published an article I wrote on this topic about a year ago, parts of which I'm including today. I just want to begin with a brief look at a slice of Westinghouse history in Pittsburgh region, leading up to the Churchill R&D Center coming together. By the early 1900s, the expanding enterprise of Westinghouse Electric started in Pittsburgh's Garrison Alleyway, and it had grown to include a vast range of companies and holdings in the United States and abroad. The presence of Westinghouse throughout East Pittsburgh in particular in the early 20th century is marked by several notable structures and unique company facilities, some of which are intact and have been repurposed today. The Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing main plant stretched 40 acres along Turtle Creek off of the Monongahela River and was built in the 1890s, not long after the company's founding. They operated for decades. The main Pittsburgh workshop at Center was thought to be the largest and most modern in the world at the time. The interior conveys the impressive scale where electric railway motors and more was facilitated. The site has since undergone a comprehensive renovation, reimagined as Keystone Commons, a high-tech, energy-efficient industrial park. It's a manufacturing and research center, once again, that addresses the needs of contemporary tenants. And of course, the 1930s bridge named after George Westinghouse stretches across the facility and is a landmark on the National Register. Just a few miles around the bend, the Westinghouse Air Brake Company in Wilmerding is where the company manufactured the revolutionary invention for the railroad industry. And the Romanesque revival structure on site was the general office of the air brake plant, later known as the Westinghouse Castle. It's in the midst of a full restoration project that aims to provide a nearby arts academy with an expansion for art galleries, science labs, sound stages, and more. It is also on the National Register. And the castle once housed the National Museum of Broadcasting, which celebrates the invention of radio broadcast by engineer Frank Conrad of Westinghouse, and they're preserving the garage where he worked. So just 2 miles north in suburban Forest Hills, the first full-scale Westinghouse research labs opened in 1916, and it operated there until 1955. It was deemed one of the world's first industrial laboratories where research was separated from manufacturing. The American Society of Metals awarded this site their historic landmark designation in 1986, acknowledging their vital contribution to special materials research. So the ingredients of Westinghouse's capacity very much so included research that reaches into the known and the unknown, and engineering that develops what research discovers, declares this company advertisement. This model portrays the public looking on at the world's first industrial atomic energy generator, which was built at Forest Hills in 1937. With an observation deck that offered a peek into how this contraption explored the potential of nuclear energy as a practical power source. Once a remarkable site along the parkway for motorists, the long abandoned 90-ton atom smasher has become a much photographed scene, and it was originally coated in aluminum paint to reflect the heat. The modern Westinghouse logo in blue, created by esteemed designer Paul Rand in 1959, must have been added much later, but it's the perfect finishing touch, symbolic of the company's continued reach into the future at mid-20th century. So by the early 1950s, Westinghouse was primed to significantly expand upon the model initiated at Forest Hills, for by now they were committed to research as an investment in tomorrow. In the context of all they had achieved to date and the buildings aptly designed to cultivate these triumphs, tonight we're taking a closer look at the 20th century modern architecture and design of the former Westinghouse Research and Development Center, known early on as George Westinghouse Research and Technology Park, sited on 150 acres in Churchill, Pennsylvania, a borough just beyond Forest Hills, about 10 miles east of Pittsburgh's downtown. Active from opening day in 1956 through until the 1990s, when usage became more sporadic, the R&D Center holds a noteworthy place in the history of modern architecture, not to mention engineering, industry, and science, and has been deemed eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. The interconnected multi-building corporate campus and landscape designed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is exemplary of mid-century and late modern suburban R&D facilities with park-like surrounds. As Mindy explained, it was recently nearly at risk for complete demolition with a proposed redevelopment plan absent of reuse, but since withdrawn. As we await a new plan or developer, we're taking the opportunity to share its significance in the context of Westinghouse, the architecture firm's work, and the period. A June 1953 press release proclaimed, Westinghouse today broke ground in Churchill Borough for the most modern research center in the electrical industry. This new facility would ultimately replace the Forest Hills campus with a significant plan for modernization and expansion. Perched along Parkway East on Interstate 376, 72 acres of what was previously a sprawling pasture land and private country estate, Westinghouse announced to the world their investment in tomorrow, and more was soon to come. On opening day in 1956, journalists, community, students, and Westinghouse employees, executives, and their families convened as the first shovel of earth was turned at the press event. The director noted that while Pittsburgh region was recognized as a capital of the steel and aluminum industry, it was not properly recognized as a major center of industrial research in the nation. He hoped that their new center would convey this while providing Westinghouse with the space and flexibility to accommodate their expanding program. They assured it would be a place of beauty and efficiency, surrounded by trees and well-landscaped lawns, so that Churchill Borough would remain known for its lush terrain. The three-story L-shaped structure featured red brick along the building's front facades and symmetrically stacked aluminum windows forming the pronounced wings projecting from the main building. These were signature moves of the architect, Voorhees, Walker, Foley, and Smith, architects engineers of New York, a prestigious firm and the go-to for companies including New York Telephone Company, later Bell Telephone. Incredibly practical, absent of unnecessary ornamentation, this is truly a form follows function structure that undoubtedly streamlined activities for the busy teams inside while remaining adaptable. It made for a comprehensive multi-purpose playground for all things Westinghouse and its growth. On the first floor, beyond the reception area, cafeteria, and auditorium, you had physics, mechanics, and metallurgy labs, as well as a machine shop and drafting room. The second floor, beyond the executive offices, housed a glass blowing facility, magnetics labs, and more. The third floor had an elaborate technical reference library and a chemical analysis lab, and the basement plan was much more than facilities with a plastics lab and mathematics wings. Progressive Architecture October 1953 edition featured the modular planning that was key to this lab's design. A configuration of individual lab units fully equipped, each with their own facilities that could receive maintenance or modification without interruption to adjacent modules. They could also be adjoined to form fuller workspaces depending on the need. The Westinghouse Churchill Lab building was based on Voorhees, Walker, Foley, and Smith's design of the legendary Bell Telephone Lab facility built in 1942 in suburban Murray Hill, New Jersey. This format has been celebrated and referenced even today, a crucible of innovation due to its dynamic interior layout, where great minds were bound to literally cross paths and result in interdisciplinary interactions. It promoted the free flow of ideas. We can easily imagine this happening in the corridors of Westinghouse. Two, as an adaptive reuse example, the former Bell Labs site now operates as Nokia Bell Labs, incorporating many of the original buildings. This month, actually, they're hosting a tour of their historic headquarters led by the company's corporate archivist and historian, supported by AT&T. The event highlights innovations realized at the labs, and it's paired with an exhibition at Princeton. Back at Churchill, with versatility and big picture progress top of mind, the next design moves by Westinghouse made good on their promise of the expansion of lab facilities and therefore ideas. Less than 2 years after opening day and completed in 1962, the sought-after Chicago, New York office of Skidmore, Owings Merrill integrated 2 new major structures onto the Churchill site. Buildings 501 and 601, along with clever circular parking lots over 300 feet in diameter and a sleek rectilinear reflecting pool with a fountain surrounded by a tree-lined plaza, added nearly 400,000 square feet to the total area. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, leaders in the post-war movement of modern architecture, sweeping the nation and responsible for some of the most remarkable engineering and architectural achievements since their founding in 1936. By Louis Skidmore, Nathaniel Owings, and their partner, John Merrill. They've always been and remain today a multidisciplinary firm known for well-integrated, cohesive design. Both in terms of style and quality, their work has stood the test of time. A 1950 exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, the first ever dedicated to a collaborative firm rather than individual designers, showcased their recent work, aptly describing it as expressing with fine craftsmanship and originality the underlying principles of modern architecture. such as the respect for engineering purity, the desire for geometric forms, the striking use of materials, especially glass and steel, those which modern technology made possible, and the avoidance of applied decoration. Scale models and photographs in the exhibit are useful comparisons leading up to their work for Westinghouse, including the Northern Indiana Hospital for Handicapped Children, a low-lying single-story premises for ease of use and access, a 2-level shopping center in California, which was a single volume housing a variety of complex functions, or this admin center for the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, a geometric composition of a 3-story service unit and adjacent offices, all connected with pedestrian concourses. It's fascinating when compared to what was expressed at Westinghouse Churchill, uniting long, low, flat forms, elegant in their simplicity and efficiency, amongst an open, expansive greenery, and incorporating intermittent landscape spaces. While structures at urban centers took advantage of airspace out of necessity, such as their renowned Lever House, which still sparkles on Park Avenue in New York, rural and industrial projects brought these forms to their side, favoring horizontal expanses. And a good example of this is Pittsburgh's own Heinz Company vinegar plant and warehouse building, completed in 1952. It was also included in the MoMA exhibition as a processing facility and called out as one of their finest forthcoming works. And in the lower right is the complementing office, also designed by SOM's lead architect, Gordon Bunshaft. And just to briefly touch on some other SOM projects in Pittsburgh, the 1966 Pittsburgh National Bank branch in Oakland neighborhood is still used as a PNC bank. The lesser known 1963 YWCA building in downtown Pittsburgh is clad with white brick, which was heavily used at the Churchill R&D Center. And finally, the Portal Bridge at Point State Park, completed in '63 during a critical time of revitalization in the area, an elegant solution and entryway to the iconic fountain and point that so defines Pittsburgh. So these were being completed around the same time that they're working on the Westinghouse project. Indeed, SOM was a fitting match for Westinghouse. They both balanced their gravitas with bold experimentation, always designing for the future in a collaborative fashion. Known as Building 501 and 601, the SOM plan in Churchill introduced a materials engineering and patents building, which contained additional labs, as well as a design lab and products engineering department equipped with facilities for the development of new consumer products. The blue dashes here indicate forthcoming structures. These photographs were taken in 2005, but they show in closer detail the white brick in a running bond pattern set back and framed by peripheral concrete beams. Building 501 includes a symmetrical grid of these bays across the main facade and is anchored with 2 sets of window sections set back from the beams. And you'll notice on the ground level, the setback is more significant, resulting in the effect of the boxy structure being raised on supporting columns, which is a firm nod to their predecessors in modern architecture. Building 601 has 11 bays along its main facade facing the plaza, with 5 sections of windows at the center. The end caps of this structure feature a ground-to-ceiling glass facade of windows. And this view features that clearly, taken by renowned photographer Ezra Stoller when the buildings were just completed. His lens captured every instance of significant modernist architecture in the United States during the 20th century, including this site. And here I think he captures the sleek, geometric, and dignified nature of these structures. As conveyed to journalist Anthony Paletta, who has been following the outcome of this site, Nicholas Adams, emeritus professor in the history of architecture at Vassar and author of Skidmore, Owings Merrill, SOM since 1936, observed that the Churchill buildings were emblematic of the firm's work, in many ways among their most Miesian buildings, referring to, of course, Mies van der Rohe, who laid the groundwork for the language of modern architecture. They effectively created low-story interior spaces that could be easily subdivided. He also noted that the language that SOM had developed was being applied at Churchill and cites their earlier CBS Research Laboratory in Stanford, the Chapel House at Colgate University, and a computer lab at Dartmouth College on the lower right. These were all simple pavilions with peripheral I-beams, he emphasized. He also stressed that the SOM team that developed the Westinghouse program managed a remarkable integration between the buildings, landscape, and to the earlier structures on site. You may have noticed by now that the red brick facade of the first 1950s building had been painted white to the edge of its gleaming aluminum sections, aiming to unify with that later SOM structures that were clad in white brick. But I'd vote for the red brick to be restored to embrace the contrast and reflecting expansion over time. Elevated pedestrian walkways provided enclosed corridors that connected one building to the next. And notice on the aerial views that both structures are punched at the center with an interior opening, presumably with surrounding windows that face an interior courtyard and introduce more natural light. And here's that feature on building 601 with a lovely view of the plaza and other structures. Interior photos are rare, but this view from a cafeteria gives a sense of what a typical setting may have felt like here on an autumn day in Pennsylvania. Another unique feature is the bridge-like walkways that lead from the second level of each building directly onto the central plaza, perched above ground level. Entrances at multiple levels, one from the main plaza versus the lower employee parking entrance, is a way in which this structure responded to its hilly terrain. And here's another view of that feature. By this stage, and mostly thanks to the circular parking lots integrated into SOM's plan, from an aerial perspective, the overall layout of the complex took on the familiar shape of a steam locomotive, complete with 3 driving wheels and a chimney. Was this architectural anatomy an intentional homage to industry and the breakthrough innovations pursued by George Westinghouse? If so, this jumbo-sized earthwork visible to air travelers inbound to Pittsburgh was certainly a very bold and modern way to honor the company's achievements, much more so than your average statue on a plaza. That composition received some extra bells and whistles, so to speak, during the 1970s in what would be the final expansion. Continuing to be directed by SOM partner and polymath Walter Nesch, Westinghouse's modern campus would culminate in 1973 with the firm's award-winning administrative office building for research and development, also known as Building 801. The goal here was to centralize various administrative functions into an executive cluster within a single structure, and the design incorporated 3 floors of office space and a lower-level cafeteria tucked into the hillside. At the time Nesch was developing this project, it was immediately following his remarkable U.S. Air Force Academy and Cadet Chapel in Colorado Springs, which speaks volumes to his versatility and status at the time. Again, the subject of Ezra Stoller's lens, the building was acknowledged with a Distinguished Building Award from the Chicago chapter of AIA in '74, and an Award of Excellence from the American Institute of Steel Construction the following year. It was one of 4 awards given to SOM, including for their Sears Tower in Chicago. The elongated low-lying form was applauded for reinforcing the horizontal ambiance of the land with uninterrupted linear forms. Glazing meeting at corners seamlessly eliminated vertical mullions, and a cantilevered perimeter replaced apparent vertical columns. With deep-hued anodized aluminum and a steel surface panels that were sourced locally, of course, and gray tinted glass, it was described as, quote, deceptively simple, but a sophisticated design, subtle yet strong, simple yet complete, and elegant in its rural setting. The interior design of this building was the vision of Robert Kleinschmidt, who was SOM's well-known interior space planner in the 60s and 70s, very loved for crafting interiors that reflected a building's persona. Described as a good neighbor to the existing structures, the admin building really came to serve as the gateway to the entire center. For the base of the building consisted of a steel truss system that allowed it to straddle the roadway for traffic to flow beneath. This design solution further emphasized the building's relationship to the surrounding land and the importance placed on the user experience of the campus, not to mention the site's relationship to the almighty vehicle. One final white multi-story structure was added in 1974 and housed components of the Generation Technology Systems Division, a tenant to Westinghouse. There's another view of that building from the roadway. Zooming out for a moment to ask why Churchill? The predominantly residential and modestly sized borough formed in 1936. By the 1950s, Churchill had a relationship with roadways radiating from downtown Pittsburgh. The new Parkway East Highway opened in 53 and stretched to Churchill. With later extensions, the borough became an interchange, and it was maintained as an island of green space in the midst of traffic. The Westinghouse R&D Center was included in a 1962 article by historian James Van Trump in the Charrette, an excellent publication of the Pittsburgh Architectural Club. Castles Towards Tomorrow discusses industrial parks, an important trend of the period. There is a contemporary castle abroad in the land, said Van Trump. Since the end of the Second World War, American industry has been steadily moving into suburban areas as motor transport has so enormously increased and the boundaries of city, suburb, and countryside have become more fluid and uncertain. Industry itself is leaving its outmoded metropolitan quarters, seeking in the outer leafy groves a brighter, more spacious site. He describes the Westinghouse R&D site as a commanding and interesting element in the landscape, and also mentions Copper's Company Research Center in nearby Monroeville. Van Trump also cites some of the likely motivations and benefits for both the local community and incoming company. For the community, a definite asset, a source of tax revenue, often paired with a concession that the site would be buffered with a pleasant surrounding landscape. And for the company, less expensive and abundant land, a stable labor supply, and better integration with markets that may have also been dispersing. The powerful factor also, of course, is the expanding network of highways and the ease of motor transport being of prime importance. The close proximity to the cultural offerings and unique setting of Pittsburgh was heavily emphasized by Westinghouse, enticing leading experts from around the globe, hailing from over 30 countries, in fact, to join efforts at Churchill. So as for that landscaping throughout the campus, Westinghouse materials engineer Frank Castle is actually credited in one source as the designer of the Churchill landscape experience. He expressed his horticultural enthusiasm in articles published in the research newsletter by Westinghouse. It likely seems that SOM would have been involved to some extent, especially with the plantings dotting the plaza and the reflecting pool, which certainly was part of their design. An official landscape guide published in 1968 folded out to roadmap size and suggested self-guided tours, each beginning at the central plaza. It covered colorful blooms, dwarf evergreens, Western Pennsylvania's beloved rhododendron, and shade trees from maples to poplars. Nearly 400 native and curated species were integrated throughout the site, enhancing the setting for employees, executives, and guests, encouraging the use of walking paths, open fields, and wooded areas. There was even a reservoir-like lake containing wildlife. Between buildings 401 and 801, there was a Japanese memorial garden presented to Westinghouse by Mitsubishi Electric Corporation in 1973. This was the 50th anniversary of their association. The garden contained a stone lantern, evergreen pines, bright azaleas, and a small pond with a wooden bridge. In the background, you can see the 73 SOM dark steel and aluminum structure meeting the 1950s building. Another remarkable structure was nestled in the landscape. However, this one was not designed by a world-class architecture firm, but prefabricated in Finland as a modest frame house and shipped to Westinghouse, where it was sited in the woods adjacent to the main campus. It functioned as an experimental project called Home Lab. It was a testing site for materials, equipment, construction techniques, and pre-market concepts being explored by Westinghouse designers. They cooked up concepts in Home Lab related to rainwater collection and purification, solar panels for heating and cooling, energy-saving automated systems for domestic tasks, air cleaning, and even recycled newspaper made into furniture. If remnants of the Home Lab were found on the Churchill site, it would be fascinating. These press clippings are dated 1972 and 73, so quite ahead of its time, as all things Westinghouse were. It's worth mentioning the culture of design excellence across departments during this period for Westinghouse. Everything from graphic design to the selection of major collaborators impacted one's experience of the company. It would have likely been influenced by their in-house corporate design center that was housed on the 11th floor of 11th Sandwich Street in Gateway Center, downtown Pittsburgh. It was a modernist 23-story high-rise completed in 1969 by Harrison and Abramovitz of New York, and it still uses offices today by various tenants. Design leaders Elliot Noyes and Paul Rand were instrumental in the department. Rand is shown here in their office. They offered resources and expertise to Westinghouse operations interested in good functional design and a unified and contemporary appearance for products, buildings, and graphic material. Indeed, they contributed toward architecture and interior design projects across the company and many innovative structures. And I don't doubt that they probably had a voice in the conversation during the work with SOM. Not a mile down the parkway from R&D is the former Westinghouse Telecomputer Center, designed by Elliot Noyes in 1964. He also designed the Westinghouse time capsules that were presented at the 1964 World's Fair. So certainly the groundbreaking activities that happened within the walls of Westinghouse and those 5 built structures are just as important to the site's significance. The R&D conducted on campus led to countless industrial innovations and everyday products materializing. Yes, they were commemorated in time capsules, but also in film. In 1965, Charles Eames, the famed multidisciplinary designer, created a film entitled Westinghouse in Alphabetical Order, and it was described by the Eames office as the most outstanding example of industrial film ever conceived. It's a quick running sequence of Westinghouse products, from household appliance to giant turbines, presented in alphabetical order. A choral group sings the name of each item as it appears, and the music is by the great American composer, Elmer Bernstein. On site in Churchill, they had a research mini theater that offered a series of 6 short films and gave you a glimpse into the purpose, progress, and people connected with the projects underway at the labs. Topics included coal gasification, nuclear reactor design and construction, electron beam technology, and conservation, recycling, and environmental concepts that were being conducted at Home Lab. They also indicated they were to build an exhibit hall that would be part of the experience of learning more about their work. So featured in these short films and behind all of the innovations were the engineers, scientists, researchers, directors, specialists, the people of Westinghouse, transforming scientific phenomena into advanced technologies for use in creating new processes, improved materials, and sophisticated systems. A range of departments that read like a complex family tree and was always adapting was established in the first new building and grew throughout the years. Work at the labs essentially fell under 2 categories: materials and systems, and ranged from mathematics, radiation, communication and display, power conditioning, materials consulting, instruction technology, and of course, electromechanics. Applications and consumer products that impacted everyday lives in somewhat more immediate ways, including broadcast systems, were also had a place at the facility. Though the campus was initially conceived to be restricted to research and development, eventually light industry product manufacturing, at the very least prototypes, seemed to have taken place at the facility. The Westinghouse Corporate Collection at Hines, History Center, Library, and Archives offers an incredible glimpse into the remarkable work of the corporation leading up to and during the Churchill years. And as I said, I've had the honor of conversing with some of those former employees who have shared their memories and photographs, so I hope to continue working with them. Through until the 1990s, the Churchill campus served Westinghouse and affiliates until they sold the bulk of the property in 2012, and it came to be owned by NIA Pittsburgh Churchill Crossings, as Mindy explained, with some areas occupied by tenants and a portion offered as facilities for film production. I do want to mention that during the spring of 2020, Churchill Borough Council launched a series of in-depth visioning workshops. facilitated by consultant PASHPO and MTR regarding redevelopment on this now vacant C1 commercial site. They had advisors ranging from historic preservation professionals to urban planners, and guided through 6 sessions that engaged Churchill community feedback. It's too much to go into detail tonight, but the sessions and resulting report provide incredibly useful insight and demonstrate a significant effort as to Churchill community's key perspectives on the issue of the future and redevelopment of this site. And here we are today. I hope that my overview of the site's place in the history of modern architecture and design can serve as inspiration as conversations continue. As part of a nonprofit organization, we aim to support partners and community members in learning more about their region's unique heritage, and the opportunities for celebrating it in the context of contemporary solutions. I will just say that it would be a worthwhile effort to revisit the feasibility of revitalizing this remarkable site. It is key in Pittsburgh's legacy of innovation, its modernist architecture, topography, and landscape features in a way that honors the Westinghouse history, the way other regional sites have done, while fulfilling a Churchill vision for the future. It's an opportunity in Greater Pittsburgh that should not be missed. And certainly one that was achieved at Bell Labs, which you'll hear more about tonight, of course. So with that, I'm going to pass things to Bill Callahan with the Pennsylvania State Historic Office to share more about harnessing those opportunities. Thank you.
And I just want to very briefly talk a little bit about, to transition into the conversation about Bell Labs, a little bit about maybe some of the opportunities and some of the measurable ways we can look at this site in terms of the redevelopment opportunities, given really the entire region, because of that have to do with the site's really remarkable history and design. If you're not familiar with State Historic Preservation Office, every state has one. I've worked in 3. We administer all the state and federal historic preservation programs for the Commonwealth, including federal and state project consultation, the National Register of Historic Places, which we'll talk a little bit about here. The proposed project that Brittany mentioned a couple of different times and Mindy mentioned, to redevelop the site, including clearing the entire Westinghouse facility, was subject to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act consultation. The project required a United States Army Corps of Engineers permit, which requires federal agencies to seek ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects, and most importantly, requires that interested parties, the public, be consulted as to the effects of the undertaking on historic properties. This gave local advocates, preservation advocates, and community members, advocates like Preservation Pittsburgh and Preservation Pennsylvania, the opportunity, gave them a structured opportunity to let folks know that this was in fact an historic place, and that its historic character should be taken into consideration for any kind of development project. The Section 106 process requires, if we consult on a project, that the property be considered historic. And historic is defined as properties that are listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. The Corps of Engineers required that a study be done to assess the historic significance of the site. The developer for the site engaged a professional to research and develop a National Register eligibility form for the site. Our office determined that, in our opinion, the site was eligible for the National Register, and the Corps of Engineers agreed. So we then treated the site as it was historic. The National Register is the nation's list of significant historic properties. It's an excellent planning tool. It is a good way for any development, municipality, preservation advocacy organization to understand what may be historic in their community, provides recognition to historic properties, and hopefully encourages their preservation. And it does also provide basic eligibility for financial incentives when they're available. It's also a very strong community and economic development tool. What the National Register doesn't do is protect private property. It does not require that property owners maintain their property in any given way. That does not trigger or require any kind of local zoning or local design review. So the National Register eligibility determination did require then that for this proposed project, that we treat the site, the Westinghouse site, as significant as a National Register eligible property, but it did not mean necessarily that the site would be preserved in any way. That preservation outcome is not mandated through the process. So that's how our office got involved, and I think the process worked insofar as the public was given an opportunity to weigh in on the historic significance of the site, and that the significance of the site meant something to the community. There are, this is where we now transition a bit into what we're going to talk about with our next speakers. We'll talk about Bell Labs. There are very good reasons, not only from a cultural preservation point of view, to preserve and consider the historic character of a historic property for a development, but there's also good demonstrable economic development and economic tools that can be economic points of view and tools that can be used to help assist and facilitate a project or a program that is sensitive to the cultural and historic significance of the site. One of the most powerful of these tools, of course, is the federal Rehabilitation Investment Tax Credit Program. Pennsylvania is one of many states that also offers a state rehabilitation tax credit. These two credits are often combined, and they're a powerful tool to facilitate the preservation of and adapted reuse of historic properties. The Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office also administers a couple of preservation grants. I would probably at this stage direct you to take a look at the preservation project grants. I think if there's any folks associated with Churchill Borough, I'd love to chat about how a project grant could be used to help facilitate a planning process to kind of guide a sensitive redevelopment of the site. Perhaps the most common question that I get is that historical preservation stuff. What is it? What do you really mean by that when you say historic preservation, Bill? To my mind, and I think many, if not most, preservation advocates will tell you that preservation is a design ethic. It's the establishment of a design ethic. It's a management tool. It should, in its strongest sense, to be used as a way to promote economic vitality, marketing, and community development through the lens of traditional design principles, traditional to that place, the place where the property is located. It's not a way to make a place feel like a museum. We often run into the concept, the idea that somehow historic properties have to be frozen in time in some way. And that's simply not the case. We have to understand the culture and the design and the history behind a historic place and establish what the most significant visual characteristics, historic characteristics of those places are, and find a way to develop around those characteristics in a way that makes the site usable, makes it work for a living, if you will, but also is sensitive to the overall design of the resource. A preservation design ethic doesn't need to be complicated. It's something that we look at from the aspect of what's already there, and how we can design with that in mind. A preservation design ethic doesn't need to stifle new development or creative new design. I think the presentation we just saw from Brittany helps us understand that creative new design can often even help us anticipate what new creative design can be. That historic creative design can inform what happens next. I'm endlessly fascinated with this locomotive design of the site itself, because the designers in some way understood what it was they were working with. They were working with a company that had a long history and a long culture of innovation and design, and they throw back to that with the landscape design, the overall design of the site. So new design can be incorporated into sensitive historic rehabilitation and techniques in a fashion that is sensitive to that overall character. National corporations, local businesses, anyone can tell you that using locally sensitive design principles to establish creative, entrepreneurial, and even long-standing businesses and use the historic properties as the place where these businesses take place. This can happen in a way that is sensitive to the historic character of the buildings and meets the needs of the company that wishes to have an income and have an adequate income from the site where the project takes place. We know this works. We've been studying this. I've been doing this for about 35 years, and we've done studies like this over and over. And there is a long-standing kind of perception that you can either have development in progress or you can have historic preservation, and that they can't go together. And that's simply not the case. We've studied this to death. We know that rehabilitation projects generate local dollars, generate local investment opportunities and job creation. We know that a rehabilitation ethic, a preservation ethic that's implemented on development projects yields much higher effects on employment, income, gross domestic product, state and local taxes than an equal investment in new construction. This has been studied over and over. It simply is. There's also the case to be made, a very strong case, that rehabilitation, a preservation design ethic is the most sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and in many ways marketable way to promote a new development. Again, these are things that we have studied at length, and we know the marketability of environmentally sustainable properties is something that many corporations, many companies, and many entrepreneurs are looking for when they're looking for the opportunity to develop their businesses. And we know that in terms of the different ways different generations have come to look at how we develop our communities. There's a lot of overlap. Not every millennial or Generation Z individual or someone from the creative class who can live pretty much anywhere they want, and certainly not retiring baby boomers necessarily all want the same thing, but we do know that there's a lot of overlap in the desirability of these different generations of historic places. We know that many of these folks are looking for authenticity. We know that we're looking for access to recreation, and many folks are very much interested in sustainable development. So we can market to and be aware of how different generational entrepreneurs and business people look at our historic communities as investment opportunities, development opportunities. When we look at historic resources, kind of from a broader sense, And we look at these things from the sense of economic benefit. People are looking for connections to experiences, and Brittany so eloquently laid out the experience one can have at this site, how this site is connected to the community, how it's connected to Pittsburgh's deep innovation and technological history of technological innovation, and these kinds of connections to experiences and connections to not just historic properties, but also natural resource conservation, outdoor recreation. When we ask people, whether it's people who live in these communities or people who are looking for ways to invest in communities and invest in businesses, when we ask them, what do you value in the places where you live or places where you want to invest, they tell us they are interested in authenticity. They're interested in natural resource conservation, outdoor recreation opportunities. These things tie together in a very neat and natural way. And again, this is not a blue sky issue. This is something that we've studied over time in a way that helps us understand how these kinds of approaches to community development, economic development can work together. And I find myself fascinated. I had the privilege of participating in Churchill Borough's visioning, C1 visioning plan that Brittany mentioned. It had been almost 3 years since that was put together, and I hadn't read the report since then. And I'm really kind of fascinated that community-based visioning plan that the Borough Council put together really closely kind of jives with the kind of ways to look at historic resources and the kind of site this is that I've just described. If I encourage anyone who's interested to I can drop this link into the chat. I think this is the full report. It's on the borough website. It's fascinating how the visioning plan reflects so many of the kind of approaches that I just described that can be used to utilize historic resources as economic and community development opportunities. So I encourage you to take a look at it was good work that was done in 2020. Take this out. That's all I have to say. I'm just simply trying to make a transition from Brittany's fine presentation to the more or less kind of completed version of a development opportunity at the Bell Labs, where the historic resources were used as part of incorporation of a really successful and very nicely done economic development opportunity. So thank you for your.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the evening, the Westinghouse complex was placed on the 2022 Pennsylvania at-risk list. This is an annual listing of threatened historic places in Pennsylvania that guide the work of Preservation Pennsylvania. In 2022, it marked our 30th year of the Pennsylvania at-risk program. And while we know that not every resource can be saved, we are proud of what we've accomplished. With 255 properties listed since 1992, we've saved 89, which is 35%. 27 have been partially saved, meaning that we've kept some portion of it or it has been reused while respecting its original appearance, and that's 11%. We have lost 58, that's 22%. And 81 are still at risk. So today, February 1st, our 2023 Pennsylvania at-risk program is open for nominations. Please visit our website for details. The deadline is February 28th, and the 2023 list will be announced during Preservation Month in May. So the second part of tonight's webinar is going to showcase the former Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey, and its conversion into Bellworks. Our speakers, I'll introduce our speakers and turn it over to them. Alexander Gorlin is a principal at Alexander Gorlin Architects. The firm is renowned for its ability to create welcoming spaces with a modernist aesthetic. The practice is founded on the belief that excellent design should be applied to all realms of society. The firm's work has received numerous accolades, including multiple design excellence awards from the American Institute of Architects, and has been published in Architectural Digest, Architectural Record, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Gorlin was recognized in 2005 by the American Institute of Architects for his significant contributions to the profession by bestowing on him with one of the highest honors, that of promotion to fellowship. Our second speaker is Cindy Hamilton. She is the president of Heritage Consulting Group. Cindy joined Heritage Consulting Group in this capacity in 2020. I'm sorry. She joined Heritage Consulting Group in 2004 and became president in 2021. She develops strategies for owners to maximize rehabilitation incentives and represents clients in negotiations through all aspects of the historic tax credit process. With 25 years of experience in the industry, Cindy has a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory process and is adept at identifying creative solutions to achieve favorable outcomes for clients. Prior to joining Heritage Consulting, Cindy worked as a Mid-Atlantic regional historic consultant, listing dozens of buildings on the National Register and managing hundreds of historic tax credit projects. With a background in architectural conservation, Cindy developed specialties in historic building technologies and architectural finishes. So if you'll just give us
thank you all, and it's a pleasure to present to you my experience at Bell Labs, which was an extraordinary opportunity to work at a monumental scale on a building of extraordinary historical importance, both for the history of science as well as for architecture. And Bell Labs was started by, as you might expect, Alexander Graham Bell, after he was awarded the patent for the telephone in 1876. And one of the first locations was what is now West Beth in Manhattan, a building from 1876 on the west side facing the Hudson River. They then moved to a kind of ramshackle facilities in Holmdel, New Jersey, as well as a more elaborate facility in Murray Hill. But Bell Labs was known over the years for the extraordinary inventions and research that was done, including it was the site in 1933 of Carl Jansky's merry-go-round radio telescope, which was really the beginning of radio astronomy. And while looking for communications issues, especially for transatlantic communications, this radio telescope discovered the background radiation or radio frequencies from the center of the Milky Way. So Bell Labs, and especially the site at Holmdel, has not just local New Jersey importance, but cosmic importance, which is not something one can say about most historic properties. Next. And this is the Horn telescope from 1959 near the Bell Labs site in Holmdel. And from here, actually, the background radiation to the Big Bang creation of the universe was discovered, not to be outdone by Jansky, by Robert Wilson, who won a Nobel Prize for this along with his colleague. Next. And so Bell Labs, this is the Holmdel facility, and these are the scientists, arrayed down the hall. And one of the aspects which was curious and became one of the issues in the adaptive reuse was that they basically worked in windowless labs and to kind of meditate and work on their projects, their research projects, not all of which were commercially directed. So this was still a place where one could think of non-applied research because Bell Labs was a monopoly and there was no budget really for, they had extra money for just theoretical research. Next. And then some of the consumer applications that were invented here was the picture phone, which this was from the 1950s, and actually was first seen in Kubrick's movie 2001. And in fact, the HAL computer, the evil HAL 9000, when he was disconnected and sang and started to lose the artificial intelligence, the song Daisy was in fact sung first at Bell Labs in Holmdel in the 1960s. Next. And also the Telstar satellite was invented here for communications, as well as the laser. And also, which is not often displayed by Bell Labs for PR purposes, it also had a lot of military research going on because it related to communications, and so therefore the guided missile systems of the anti-ballistic missiles were developed at Bell Labs. And at one point they even were in charge of the Sandia laboratories in Los Alamos in New Mexico, but they were run from Bell Labs in New Jersey. So the whole range from consumer to apocalyptic research went on in this legendary facility. Next. And the architect of this specific building was Eero Saarinen, the Finnish-American architect who was one of the masters of modern architecture in the 1950s. And his father, Eliel, was from Finland and did work in Helsinki, and then came to the United States and did the Cranbrook Academy outside of Detroit. And Saarinen was especially known for reinvigorating modern architecture in the 50s, which had become ossified, especially through, well, ironically, through the Miesian grids that, actually, this is something we could discuss, that often corporate architecture displayed. So Saarinen was eclectic. He didn't have one style, but he was basically very theatrical. Next. So he's famous for the TWA building at Kennedy Airport, which inspired by Expressionist architecture and Le Corbusier's Ronchamp, it gives the impression of a flying eagle, a soaring bird, which was recently restored, actually, although sadly surrounded by the JetBlue facility, as one would know if you've been to Kennedy Airport. Next. He also did Dulles Airport, which has expressionistic tendencies, especially with the way the structure goes through the canopy. So the support, it seems to float as opposed to support the soaring canopy above. Next. He also did the St. Louis Arch, which is a grand, you know, kind of portal to the west. Next. And as well, of which Bell is part of, he did a series of corporate headquarters, corporate campuses, including General Motors in Detroit, the IBM facility, upstate New York, and others, of which Bell Labs is part of the suburban campus, which is also it's part of their demise, really, because when people were leaving the cities, they fled to suburbia, and these were seen as self-contained campuses apart from any connection to the neighboring towns or buildings. Actually, Apple has done this recently, which is unusual, in their Cupertino flying saucer circle headquarters. Next. So Bell Labs was set up on 472 acres in Holmdel, New Jersey, which is about 45 minutes from Manhattan. This is an early model of an earlier design in which the access is through a central road, like Versailles, to a palace in the landscape. Next. The design that was built, actually, the ring road was split in two in a kind of perspectival V, which became a keyhole, which is part of what was preserved, which Cindy will go into in more detail. And in keeping with the supremacy of the road and the car in the 1950s, it's conceived as kind of a highway, a ring road in a football shape, another American icon, whose dimensions appear throughout the building as well. And there are no, you cannot really turn at any point without going around. So to get to the building, even though there's a view of it, you have to make a right turn and then turn around as you would on a highway. Next. And this shows the full build out of Saarinen's initial design, which was in two stages. The first block in the front, which is conceived in terms of two smaller blocks, and then that's mirrored across the atrium that you see in three parts to the rear. So it's a 4-block concept or partie that creates this crossing of almost a street in the center of the building. The canopy in the front is where you drop off people coming into the building, and the two side access roads are for deliveries, which then become masked by the additions by Kevin Roche, which we'll see next. This is the construction in 1962. Saarinen designed this in 1960, but he died in 1961, so he actually never saw the full construction of the building. So you see the lower level and then the 5 levels of laboratories. And what's fascinating in terms of the preservation, you see the 2 exposed blocks, which are the stair towers and elevator and bathroom cores, which were on the outside. Next. And then this is the full block, which is has a 800-foot long mirrored facade. It was the largest mirrored facade up to that time. This is in 1962. Next. And then in the rear, you see the exposed towers. You see these planters in between. And then in the next phase, in 1964, this block was mirrored, and then the atriums were covered over, and facades were put on the end of each block. And then to the left, you see the cafeteria, which was outside at this point, and access only through the lower level. And what's curious too is which is what we did. The roof of the cafeteria was never meant to be inhabited or used. It was simply an exposed rubber roof with stones to keep the rubber membrane from flying off. Next. And this is as it was when we found it in 2008, with the 2 additions by Kevin Roche on either side, extending the full 1,150 feet of Bell Labs, a 2 million square foot facility with the lake in the front and the landscape in the back and the parking on either side. Next. This was the original entrance with the canopy in brutalist concrete that actually recalls, like Westinghouse, a bank canopy or a gas station, again, because the car was king at the time. And that, in contrast to the mirrored facade, creates this tension between the rough and the smooth. Next. And this was the entrance. And what's also curious, you see there's really there's the connection between the canopy and the building is by this hanging secondary structure that is not totally gives shelter from the rain. So it was never totally practical. Next. And then parts of the building, I believe, were inspired by some of the inventions at Bell. One of the most important was the three-pronged transistor that replaced the vacuum tubes, which were much bigger and bulkier. And actually, and so the transistor compressed and miniaturized electronics that led to the computer. And that three-pronged transistor in some ways was an inspiration for the water tower next at Bell, which has this saucer-like dish that had the water in it. There was an elevator to the top that originally we were planning to renovate as well. And this was the original length of the building in the distance. Next. And that and another imagery that's recalled by Saarinen is from the 50s, the War of the Worlds, which actually took place, nearby. Actually, it's the radio broadcast by the author of Citizen Kane that actually caused a panic in the area of these aliens on spindly feet, just like the Bell Water Tower or the flying saucer that created great psychosis in the 50s as well. So the building in many ways embodies the thinking and culture of the 50s. Next. And it was then when Bell was divided up and broken up by Congress into smaller mini Bells, they no longer had the capability to support a building of this scale of 2 million square feet. And it was sold to Alcatel-Lucent, who didn't really utilize it. And it was, when we found it, it was a kind of modernist ruin, abandoned. It was maintained up to a point, but basically overgrown and a ruin. Next. And the inside also, these were planters from the original design, was overgrown, it wasn't maintained. It was a kind of a haunting space of emptiness where there originally had been 6,000 people working every day. Next. And this is the side atrium, half of which was done, well, 2/3 of which was done by Kevin Roche. And in fact, the building was not big enough for the 6,000 people, so that they started to fill up the atriums with office space and conference rooms. And these were fountains that were also abandoned that we restored. Next. And one of the main problems, and then I'll hand this over to Cindy, was again that the scientists worked behind these solid metal panels in these windowless labs. And when they wanted to come out for air, they would go to these long balconies, every 20 feet of which had an ashtray. So again, the 50s, a time of smoking for social purpose. You would come out and exchange ideas with your fellow scientists and have a smoke along the balconies. And those ashtrays are still there. They are sealed up. But this was the key. This was the main impediment to the renting of the space. And this was this drawing was really the key to the adaptive reuse that made it possible to rent and preserve the building, because you see the grid every 3 feet on the upper drawing of the interior elevation. The grid is marked by lines, and we argued before the National Park Service because no materiality is noted. And we argued that the importance was the concept of the 3-foot module, not that the materiality of the metal solid opaque panels. And Cindy, in fact, found a drawing that showed that this was glass. And so they accepted that we would open up the atrium to light, and therefore practical for rentability. And then the project really took off. So now I will hand this off to Cindy, who will go into detail about the process.
So, Alex mentioned that the building was in ruins, and it was actually slated for demolition, which a lot of people don't realize. The historic tax credits are what really provided the equity, which allowed for the rehabilitation of the building. And, people wonder, why do you go for the historic tax credits? And it does bring a regulatory review, as Bill mentioned. And the developer does not have carte blanche if you're using historic tax credits. The project has to meet the standards. There are challenges along the way. But I'm going to show you what challenges we faced at Bell and show you how we were able to overcome those challenges and how we came to resolution. And this award-winning project would certainly not have happened without the historic tax credits. And it's a great example of how you can use this incentive for a site like Bell, Mid-Century Office Park. So Bill talked about the historic tax credits, and developers opt to use it because it's a meaningful equity source. In the example that you see on the slide, if you have a $10 million rehabilitation, it's a 20% credit, that's $2 million in federal historic tax credits. So, Bell Labs is hundreds of millions in rehabilitation. So if you do the math, it's a meaningful equity source. So I won't get too deep into the requirements, but there's basically 4 requirements to use historic tax credits. The building has to be listed in the National Register. I'll talk a little bit more about that process and how we got through that. The building must be income producing. Certainly that wasn't an issue at Bell. The rehab must be substantial, also not an issue at Bell. And all the work must meet the standards known as the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the standards. It's a pretty straightforward application process, 3 parts. If you've heard people talk about historic tax credits, it's a part 1, 2, 3 process. Part 1 is evaluating the significance of the building. Part 2 is a description of the rehabilitation, and part 3 is final certification at the end of the project. So it's a pretty straightforward process. And it's a program administered by the IRS, and all work is reviewed at 2 levels, state and federal. Every state has a state historic preservation office, as Bill mentioned. The SHPO is advisory to the National Park Service. The National Park Service is the final decision maker. So Bell is a remarkable site, no question. But at the start of the project, which is back in 2014, honestly, few people really understood this building, and it was not widely recognized as a historic or architectural landmark by the general public. So in order to utilize the historic tax credits, the building must be listed in the National Register, and you can list buildings individually or as part of a larger district. At the start of this project, Bell was not listed, so we had to list the building so that the developer could utilize the credits. So today, Bell Labs may seem like a very obvious candidate for National Register listing, but that was not the case when we started the process. Suburban office complexes as a typology had really not begun to be considered historic, and not much has been written about the history of office parks. So it was a more complicated process than one might think. And we really had 3 issues that required negotiation, and I'll talk about each of these, but it's identifying the area of significance, identifying the period of significance, and selecting a boundary. So when you're nominating a building, you're nominating for historical and or architectural significance. Initially, we proposed both. But ultimately, the National Park Service determined that listing the building for its architectural significance was the more straightforward path. So you only need one area of significance, and it was determined that historical significance posed a lot of challenges because we would have needed to understand exactly which technologies and events occurred at Bell as opposed to earlier sites. So the building was actually listed under architectural significance for the work of Saarinen and the landscape design of Sasaki Walker and Associates. And it is a superior example of mid-century office park. Oh, Alex showed you those great photos of the building, but this sort of simply captures the evolution. So the yellow portion, the original 2 pavilions in 1962, and then adding the red 2 pavilions in 66. And then in blue, we have the Roche end caps in 1985. So when you're listing a building, you have to come up with a period of significance, and that's really the period in time during which the building achieved its historical or architectural significance. There is a 50-year benchmark, but you can list a building that's not yet 50 years old, and your period of significance doesn't have to end at 50 years. So, we wanted to use the credits on the whole building. We wanted the whole building to be considered historic and within the period of significance. So we argued for a period of significance capturing the entire period of construction, 1959, with the very first construction on the site, all the way up to 1985, when the last phase was complete. So you also have to select a boundary when you're doing a National Register listing. And interestingly, this site was actually huge. It was 472 acres originally, but that site had been subdivided and there had been new construction. So the National Register, National Park Service National Register staff actually visited the site, which is unusual. They don't often visit these sites. And they actually took great interest in the site and in the decision making for what was listed. And ultimately, it was determined that listing of the keyhole, which what Alex talked about, what you see here in the yellow boundary, that was the most appropriate boundary because it really reflected the designed portion of the site, that captured the architectural and landscape architecture significance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historic tax credit project, so the regulatory review of the scope of work, and I'm going to show you the challenges that we faced and how we overcame them. So the standards that you have to meet when you're using historic tax credits are these Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. Rehabilitation implies that there's flexibility. It's not restoration, it's rehabilitation. And the way it works is all the work has to meet the standards. So the full scope. So that's the site, the exterior, the interior, all 2 million square feet of interior. And the reviewers are interpreting how proposed changes will impact character defining features, the features that define the character of the building. So it's 10 very general standards applied to every building type. So there is inherent subjectivity in the process of reviewing. So the key is really anticipating what the state and the National Park Service will view as important, what they will permit, and what they will restrict. So, boiling it down to our 2 primary challenges, I would say first was really understanding the site and the building, just really understanding what is there and what is important. And then trying to figure out how to accommodate review, since the reviewers review, they have jurisdiction over the whole building. We knew we were going to have over 100 tenants, how we were going to get all that work reviewed and approved. So I'm going to show you how we overcame those challenges. So for most historic tax credit projects, the site is reviewed, but there's rarely significant site features. In this case, though, the original site design was so important, and it was listed for its landscape design in addition to the architecture. And the landscape was recognized as being exceptionally significant. And so we were required to keep a lot of landscape features within the keyhole. This is very unusual for a tax credit project. But you can see the water tower, the approach drives, which are the entrance and exit drives. There was an alley of trees that was alongside those drives, which we had to keep. The ring roads, which Alex talked about, that go around the parking lot. Even the light posts in the parking lot were original, and we had to keep those, as well as the water features and the Japanese garden. One of our biggest challenges was introducing what's now known as Jansky Drive, which was a new connecting road that connected the entrance and exit drive. So Alex mentioned it was a very inefficient site circulation. So this crossroad was really important to make the site circulation more efficient. And this was a very big deal in the project, getting this approved, because the reviewers were very concerned that we were affecting the landscape. So we had to do all kinds of sightline studies and produce all kinds of details on grading and materials. And this is what it looks like today. And this very precise grading was required so that there'd be a minimal visual impact. And it's hard to see here, but there are these very low berms on either side of Jansky Drive that help shield the view. And there is lighting. It's very low lighting. So it has a very minimal impact. And again, this is unusual for this level of scrutiny on the landscape, but in this case, justified. Usually when we're doing a historic tax credit project, there's so much work on the exterior. There's masonry work and window replacement. But with Bell, there was very limited changes made. We did replacement of doors, but that's about it. The exterior was in good condition, and we took a light touch. Most of our challenges were on the interior, and one of our initial tasks was to establish a hierarchy in this building. The reason being, generally speaking, with historic tax credit projects, there are more restrictions in primary spaces, public spaces, and more opportunities to make change in secondary and tertiary spaces. So we wanted to map out the hierarchy. So we did that. The blue is primary, green secondary, and red tertiary. So the primary was really the atrium corridor going around the atrium, and then the perimeter corridor, which goes around the whole building. The green is what we call the H corridor, simply because it's on the H column line of the building. But that's important because the H corridor marks the location of the original 62, 66 pavilions, and then starting the 1985 end cap. So they're an important demarcation in the building. And then we asserted that the office and lab space was the tertiary space in red. And here's what it looked like at the start of the project. So all the way on the left is the main atrium. In the middle at the top is the atrium corridor. Just below that is the perimeter corridor. And then to the right is the H corridor. And that's what it looked like at the start of the project. These are some photos of the office and lab areas. And it was apparent from our initial walkthrough that most of the space had been changed. And as Alex said, Saarinen designed the building for change. Central to the design was the ability to reconfigure these offices and labs as needed to meet the needs of scientists. But we really needed to examine and document these changes. So we actually did an entire building survey. So we evaluated, and this is unusual for a tax credit project, but this was such a unique building type, and because we knew that if we could prove that the building had changed over time, we would have more latitude to make additional changes. So we really had to establish what was there, what was important, and establish a baseline for decision making on what to keep. So we actually documented every type of wall construction and feature in this entire building. This is the second floor. We dated everything. And then this is every other floor in the building, second, third, fourth, fifth. It's crazy. We did this through the whole building. Again, well beyond a typical tax credit project requirement. But in the end, we proved that the building had changed so much. And so many of these changes were after the period of significance, so after 1985, and that provided us with the justification to make more changes. No question, the atrium was the most important space in the building. These are some terrific period photos. And looking at the atrium pre-rehab, you know, it was largely original, kind of tired, but largely original. This is the original conversation pit, really important mid-century feature. It remained, the carpet obviously had been replaced. And then beyond that main entrance atrium, the remainder of the atrium, and you saw the image to the left in Alex's portion, it had been altered. The flooring had been changed. You know, as Alex talked about, they had put offices in the atrium. They started building out that space. One of our big challenges were the planters. So the planters were actually removed by the owner, but long before the tax credit project. And the National Park Service was, you know, concerned and not happy that that work had been done, but ultimately they accepted that it really was done long before a tax credit project, and so they accepted that as a pre-rehab condition. And this was Alex's vision, to transform this atrium into this, you know, wonderfully interactive and engaging space. So I mentioned the flooring had been changed out, and because we proved that, that provided us with an opportunity for change. And so we proposed new flooring throughout the atrium that would match the historic, but with sections of this wonderful decorative tile based on a Joseph Albers design. And Saarinen had been a student of Albers, so we argued that this was in keeping with the spirit of Saarinen's design. And, you know, what a transformation. These Albers designs are just in you know, a couple of areas of the atrium, but so successful in creating this wonderfully engaging space. And Tim McGraw agreed. We used it for this cover, which is great. And today the space is used by people who are working in the building, but it's also a destination space for the community. When you're there, you see people walking for exercise, studying, meeting. Most of the floor is the gray slate matching the historic, but the Albers tile and then that area of turf on the bottom right provides some relief and really re-energizes the space. And you can see in the top right, we put back the yellow rug to match the original condition in the main entrance atrium. So another challenge we faced was in this pre-function space, which was outside of the cafeteria, the first floor. So initially we were perplexed. It wasn't really clear if these were original features. This is a glass wall, it's a decorative colored glass wall. And there was on the left that low glass partition wall of blue glass, and then this seating, which was confusing. Is this, you know, original? We weren't sure that, you know, that black bench on the right photo. So, we were going to have to keep it unless we could prove it wasn't historic. So we did some research and we actually found drawings that the whole space had been rehabbed around 2000 by Kling Lindquist. And because we found those drawings, we were able to prove that this work happened after the period of significance. So we were able to remove these features and change the space. So here's what it looks like today. And it's really it shows the importance of the period of significance in decision making for the rehabilitation. And Bill mentioned that there is this opportunity for new creative design, and this is a good example of flexibility in the tax credit program. So adjacent to that is the cafeteria, and Alex talked about how the scientists would gather at the ashtrays, but this was also such an important space because the scientists gathered here to discuss the technologies that they were developing, and it was known to be this very collaborative space. So it's a very important space, and we knew it would be tough to make changes here. So the developer wanted to use this as an event space, which was great, but there were some serious sound attenuation issues. So we studied the historic photo on the right and then the pre-rehab and compared the two, trying to find opportunities where we could prove change had occurred. So we had this slate floor and we had, the original glazed walls and the concrete columns, and we knew we weren't going to have a lot of opportunity there. But then we were looking at the baffles at the ceiling, trying to figure out if those were original. If they were original, that was going to present an issue. So we compared the current condition pre-rehab with the historic photo, and we noticed in the historic photo that the baffles were a little shorter. They didn't go all the way down to the bottom of that concrete beam. So that was our first clue that they may not be the original baffles. The original baffles appeared shorter. So we got up on the ceiling and pulled open a baffle and were able to prove it was modern. And I mean, as silly as it sounds, it was a huge find because that gave us the opportunity to then replace the baffles with something that was far more improved in terms of sound attenuation, but still closely matching the historic condition. And here it is today. So we have our new baffles, much improved sound attenuation. And because we removed what was there, we were able to put in new LED lighting above to create these very dramatic effect for the events. So Alex talked about one of our biggest challenges was that the offices and labs had no windows. So, the scientists had some indirect light from the perimeter corridor and the atrium corridor, but they were windowless. And we knew that the biggest problem we faced is that there was no market for windowless offices, especially 2 million square feet of windowless offices. So we looked at the pre-rehab conditions and we did that building-wide survey that I showed, and we were able to prove that this building had changed so much over time, and all these windows had been added. This is the perimeter corridor. Windows had been added, all different configurations, entire sections of wall replaced with gypsum board and new windows. And same at the atrium, kind of a little bit of a inconsistent approach to putting in windows as opposed to meet the needs of the scientists working behind them. And then we did some research at the Yale Archives and were able to find drawings and models that showed that Saarinen's intent was clearly for glazing. He wanted these walls to be glazed, but we determined that the fire codes actually are what prevented it, and they were not able to use glazed walls. So they built solid walls throughout. And the SHPO and the National Park Service understood how critical this was and accepted that because we proved the original design intent and because windows had been added over the years, they agreed to allow for replacement with glazing, and they entertained multiple proposals for introducing glazing. We had multiple meetings in Washington, D.C. to hash out a solution, and the solution that we reached allowed for extensive glazing. Again, it was the original intent, and the Park Service accepted it was critical for the success of the project. Without this compromise, the project could not have happened. And this drawing shows what was approved. So the red solid areas are at the columns, at the stairs, and between the columns, we replaced the solid with glazing. And here it is today, glazing between the columns. And this was a necessary compromise and an appropriate compromise for adaptive reuse. We also recognize the importance of implementing building standards. So 100+ tenants, you can't allow every tenant to do a different storefront with different entrances. We needed some uniformity. So there were many iterations of drawings and mock-ups just to get the proportions right. And Alex mentioned the importance of the 3-foot grid or 3-foot armature that was the base dimension that Saarinen established in the building. And so what we did was we adhered to that. And you can see that the glazing and the entrances are all on the 3-foot grid, simply swapping out glazing for solid. So we also realized the importance of controlling the ceiling condition inboard of the storefront, so in the office areas inboard of the storefront, to allow for a consistent sight line. So again, with 100 tenants, you can't have 100 tenants using a different ceiling material or ceiling height up against that storefront, or you'd have a hodgepodge view, especially the sight line from the atrium. So we established this 4-foot gypsum board soffit as the building standard. So throughout the building, the first 4 feet is solid gypsum board. And then inboard of that, the tenant has some latitude for materiality and ceiling height. And this consistency and establishing these building standards was critical to achieving the uniformity, especially in a building like this with these ample sight lines. So in historic tax credit review, you're required to submit all TIs, all tenant improvements. And that's hugely challenging with 100 tenants. So we worked with the SHPO and the National Park Service on tenant guidelines. So we established approvable finishes. That included the storefronts and the entrances, but also signage and lighting and ceiling types, ceiling materials, flooring materials. And what we did was, if the tenant would submit their TI plans to the owner for approval, and if it conformed with our approved standards that the Park Service approved, we would not have to submit those for review and approval. If they went outside of those boundaries, outside of the approved standards, we would then submit an amendment for approval. And that really streamlined the tenant acquisition process, and was necessary compromise by the Park Service to allow for timely lease up of this building. And here is the atrium in action for an event. So those were our biggest challenges, but we overcame them, and the end result is this incredibly successful project. I think the key was really understanding the building, what was there, what was important. We did our research, we did building investigations, and we understood what the National Park Service would permit and where they would apply limitations. And we provided justifications for the changes we needed to make. It was very flexible approach by the project team that was also, I think, important to the success. And I think that this project shows the tremendous opportunity to reinvigorate these mid-century office parks.
First, I want to thank you all, Brittany, Bill, Cindy, and Alex, for these great presentations. It really is kind of exciting to think of the possibility of what the Westinghouse site could be after seeing what has happened at Bell. So we actually do not have that many questions, but I will go ahead and the first question was, and Bill, I know you answered this question. You answered this question, but I know you said it was an Army Corps permit that required the 106 review. Was that a stream crossing?
I don't remember exactly what the core permit was required for, but I think it was for a stream crossing. Yes, I maybe not be correct about that, but I'm pretty sure it was for a stream crossing. Correct.
Okay. And then next question, I'll just go ahead and read. This property is privately owned. Bill just mentioned grants that are available, for example, project grants. If the property owner is not interested in applying for those grants, can local governments apply for a grant for this property?
Well, in fact, the grants are available only to units of local government and nonprofit entities. My sense is that the visioning exercise was developed such a great kind of outline for how the community would like to move forward with the site, that a project grant could be used to develop implementable kind of preservation-based planning standards that could be part of the borough's comprehensive plan, or be developed as a standalone document.
The next question from the same person was, can local governments apply for planning grants for privately owned properties? And I'm assuming the answer for that is no.
No, that's correct. Only nonprofits and units of local government. So much of this depends on the development itself. Although the grants can't go to the developer, there's no reason the developer and the borough can't cooperate with developing a feasibility study, again, a planning study for development of the site, those kinds of things. But the applicant would have to be either the local government or a nonprofit.
Thanks, Bill. The next question is, can you have both residential and commercial spaces in historic buildings? Cindy, you want to go ahead and take that?
You can. If you're using tax credits, it has to be income producing, so you can't use tax credits on your private residence, but certainly multifamily apartments, absolutely. We actually have approval at Bell for a rooftop hotel, but that is on hold with COVID and financing challenges with hotels. But we don't have any sort of residential use at Bell.
And then the other question is, are there any updates on future developments at the Churchill site? Maybe you want to talk about that? Other than we're optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I can't share any specific updates. Just in general, I'm thinking how, even though it was such a primary challenge at Bell, it's kind of inspiring to hear that the kind of state of not only the site, but the perception of the site at the beginning of you pursuing that project, because I too assume that it's always been, highly recognized because of Eero Saarinen's connection with it and because of the incredibly successful outcome. So it was helpful. It's encouraging to hear what a journey that was, and then what was achieved. Yeah.
Actually, we found a drawing from Tishman Construction Company of the site plan with a big X over the building that said demolish. So.
The next question is, did Bell Labs have to deal with environmental hazards?
It was not no, it wasn't a brown site. So that was never part of it, really.
And also a question about Bell Labs. Is there efficient public transportation to and from the project site?
I wouldn't exactly say that, no.
Okay.
It wasn't designed that way at all. It was designed to be a car culture place. I mean, there is a train not too far, but it's like almost an hour and a half ride to Manhattan, and it's half that with a car.
Great. Then the next question, are there any other industrial office complexes besides Holmdel that have successful projects? And I know there are quite a few of them, none of whose names I can certainly recall at this moment. If anyone has them, we can please jump in.
Is the question about like other industrial parks that have been?
Yes, correct.
I mean, it's less of a suburban location, but one project that I wanted to mention, just because it's a useful local example, is Rockwell Park in Pittsburgh. For anyone living in Pittsburgh, it's right across from the food co-op in that neighborhood, but that to me is connected because of the presence of Rockwell as, a Pittsburgh-based innovator, an important name in that capacity, and how I'm not sure if they use historic tax credits. The structures are earlier rather than mid-century, but I feel like they've, and I haven't spoken closely with those developers, but it feels like they struck a balance between, adapting and bringing in tenants like 3M, but really clearly appreciating the historic brick structures and incorporating public amenities like cafes and things like that. So Pittsburgh-wise, a little less suburban, but no less, and therefore a little less sprawling, but it's a significantly sized complex that definitely puts the celebration of Rockwell at the forefront of their marketing. So it's one example.
Alex, do you have other examples?
Not that I've worked on. So.
Cindy, any tax credits that you can think of?
No, we haven't done another office park, but we're on the lookout.
All right, that's good.
I think some of that might be a function simply of the age of the properties we're talking about. They haven't been around long enough for people to think about in terms of one of the reasons why I just really appreciate Brittany's presentation was because it really gave us a sense of just how historic some of these places can be and how important they are to the communities that they're located within. I'm not sure everyone has gotten on board with the idea that these kinds of places are historic and can take advantage of the tax credits and other kinds of development opportunities. That's a guess. I don't know, because I'm having trouble coming up with another. Mid-century modern buildings individually, sure. I mean, we've got the Alcoa building in downtown Pittsburgh, the former Bell Telephone building in downtown Pittsburgh, but a complex like this, I'm drawing a blanket myself.
I think this question is referring to Westinghouse. What can the property be used for or modified in the interim? I guess I have had a conversation with the owner, and I think that as you are dealing with a property of this size without any significant plans, once the warehouse project pulled out, is whether you try to tackle a project like this in little bursts and eventually work through the whole site, or whether you wait for that bigger project that's going to take on the whole site. I know that it's been available for movies, correct, Brittany? That and anything else?
No, but I'm even thinking, Bill, I'm not sure precisely when the historic or the resource survey was completed, but even in that document, they mentioned that, some of the buildings aren't accessible for interior review, in part because of COVID restrictions, but also because several of them are still occupied by tenants. And then even on a drive down the parkway, you could see in recent months, all the facilities around supporting a commercial or film situation going on was kind of present at the Westinghouse site. So I think, intermittently, even tenant occupation of I can't speak to which structures or portions of those were utilized. And then, yeah, certainly for film or commercial rental, which was, advertised and may still be, the website was, Film at Churchill or something like that, with a kind of clear map of what the site provided in terms of its scope and kind of the existing setting and, space capabilities and everything like that. So as for from this moment, not certain about how active those are, but felt like those were intermittent uses in the meantime. I myself had not been able to walk through the interior, so it relied on the kind of limited resources that we're assessing site condition to kind of keep in mind.
The question was, explain how the Bell Lab property was redeveloped in collaboration with the property owner. So was this a site that was sold to a new property owner, or did you work with the existing one?
It was sold to the developer who ended up doing the project. So, yeah.
Thanks. Westinghouse still has an active presence in the buildings in the cow catcher portion of the site. It's a separate property and it has separate utilities, but access would need to be preserved. Has that come up at all in conversation? I'm sorry, I'm looking at you, Brittany, but you may not know.
No, I don't know the answer to this question. Or can you explain what is the cow catcher portion of the site?
If you're looking at the train engine, the cow catchers on the front of it.
Okay, I didn't know that steam engine. I tried to study all the parts of a train. Okay.
Sorry.
No, now I know. I'll never forget what that term means. It's a separate property and has separate utilities. Okay, yeah, I can't answer that question.
The building, both Westinghouse and Bell, seem very accessible, but at Bell, were there any unique challenges meeting modern ADA standards?
Well, actually, a ramp, technically, to my surprise, only one entrance, a handicapped accessible entrance, is required, even for a building of that scale. So there were ramps put in on the two end parts of the building, where most of the people would arrive from the parking lots. But technically, the one at the main drop-off at the center of the long block would suffice. But it really wouldn't work in terms of kind of compatibility.
It's a question about asbestos and lead paint. I'm assuming that was present on the site. I think it's always present in old buildings, or practically.
The asbestos was removed from the site, yes.
As part of this project or prior to that?
No, part of this project.
Okay.
And I see that someone else had a question about mitigation on the Westinghouse site. As some people know, there was some removal of asbestos without kind of approval, and still to be mitigated. I just saw someone comment that most of the film industry would not be allowed in most of the property, since those issues need to be mitigated for continued use. What impact does this have on the possibility for continued use? And it's helpful to hear about when it's a challenge or a very common one in other historic properties. It's just part of the budgeting.
Yeah. Someone mentioned that they were the operations manager for the site when it was separated for the remainder of the Churchill site. So that's the cow catcher portion. So Mr. Vincent, please, email us and tell us what you find out. And I think we've mostly covered the questions. There are some other comments there, people telling their personal information about the site. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the comments. I wanted to make sure that we haven't missed anything. All right. Well, again, I want to thank you all for your participation this evening. We had a great turnout, and so thank you all for coming, and everyone have a good evening.